Hello, and thank you for choosing this clean, historical Western romance by Emma Ashwood. Before we begin, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Your support allows us to keep sharing more wonderful stories for free. So grab a cozy spot, kick back, and let this story whisk you away to a different time and place. Enjoy. Copyright Emma Ashwood. The Bride's Christmas Courage by Emma Ashwood. Prologue. 18th April 1872, Canyon, Texas. Grace Manch had never minded being a governess. It had been a wonderful way for her to earn a living after losing both her parents. One day she dreamed of having a loving husband and a beautiful home, but for now she called the barren estate home. Up until a little over a month ago, Grace had been happy and content. The Barron family, known for their wealth and cattle ranching, were highly respected throughout Texas. Although ranching was at the heart of their business, the Barrons enjoyed exhibiting their wealth with extravagant parties throughout the year. Until the Christmas ball, Grace had never been invited to attend. While women wore lavish dresses and men, polished in high hats and suits, drank champagne and were merry downstairs, Grace had taken care of her charges. Then the night of the Christmas ball had arrived. In true Barron style, they invited anyone and everyone in their circle of wealth, including their handsome, wealthy neighbor, Jock Usher. Once the children were down for the night, Grace dressed in the beautiful gown that Mrs. Barron had lent her for the occasion and attended the ball. Everyone knew she was the governess and thus avoided her as the help. Everyone, except for Jock Usher. Not only did he invite her to dance, but they spoke for hours afterward. Grace fell in love without caution or heed for her place in society. It didn't bother Jock that she was a governess, so why should it have bothered her that he was a wealthy rancher? In the weeks after Christmas, their romance blossomed through secret liaisons and letters. They fell in love and dreamed of building a life together on Jock's ranch. Grace had been naive enough to believe that their dreams could actually come true, until everything changed during the first week of February. Before Grace had dressed to join the children for breakfast, two men had arrived to take her from her room. She was taken to Mrs. Barron, who made it very clear that Grace was overstepping as a governess, and her employment had been terminated. It had been decided already that Mrs. Barron would be matching Jock with her sister, Melanie, and Grace's presence would be interfering with their plans. Horrified and overwhelmed, Grace had pleaded for mercy, having nowhere else to go, but Mrs. Barron instructed the men to take Grace to a nearby boarding house where it had been arranged she would work for her room and board until she found another position as a governess. Before the men could take Grace away, Mrs. Barron insulted Grace by calling her a gold-digging hired help. Grace had spent most of the day in tears, struggling to understand how this could have happened. For the first week at the boarding house, she tried to contact Jock, but her efforts were useless as the boarding house owner intercepted all their communications. It had now been 3 months since Grace had been assigned the room in the basement. 3 months of cleaning, crying, and hoping Jock managed to find her, to save her from the nightmare that had become her life. While scrubbing the kitchen floor, Grace began to realize that it was time for her to give up on Jock altogether. If he hadn't come to look for her by now, he clearly hadn't loved her in the same way she loved him. Perhaps her station in society had mattered to him all along, and that is why they had to keep their blossoming romance a secret. She had been nothing more than Jock Usher's dirty little secret. Tears seeped from her eyes as she dunked the scrubbing brush into the water and continued to scrub. Her back was aching, her arms burning from the exertion, but if she allowed the boarding house owner to see that she was struggling to keep up with the demanding work, she would be turned out onto the street. Grace brushed a stray strand of hair from her face when the wave of nausea overcame her. She felt her mouth begin to water as her stomach churned, ready to empty itself of her breakfast. Grace tried to breathe through the nausea, but it was no use. She got to her feet and rushed to a bucket in the corner just in time. She tried to be quiet, but it was difficult to keep the noise level under control while being so ill that as to hardly catch a breath. "What's going on in here?" the owner of the boarding house demanded as he walked into the kitchen. The sound of your retching is causing concern among the guests in the breakfast room." "I'm sorry." Grace quickly apologized. "I'm truly sorry. It can't be helped." Grace drew in a few sharp breaths to clear her mind and her throat before she met the man's curious gaze. "It won't happen again." The man cocked a brow as he glanced at Grace's protruding belly. Up until now, she had tried her best to conceal her increasing girth, but her dresses were becoming too small in the waist. "I doubt that very much. You're with child, aren't you?" Grace could deny it, but what would be the use? "Yes," Grace answered with a sigh. "Pack up your things. I want you out of here in the next hour," the man said with a disgusted look. "But I have nowhere to go. You can't just put me out on the street," Grace argued. He shook his head. "This is no place for a baby, and definitely not for a woman about to have one. I'll have the last of your wages ready for you." He turned and left Grace in the kitchen staring after him. She felt as if someone had just pulled a rug out from under her. She was almost 5 months pregnant, with only a few dollars to her name and nowhere to go. How could she raise a baby in the Wild West without a home? She prayed for guidance, but God was silent. Grace placed her hands on her belly and sighed. "We'll figure this out, you and me. I'll find us a place to live." An hour later, Grace was out on the street with nothing but the clothes on her back and a small carpet bag to her name. The boarding house owner had retained the wages promised her, saying that she caused him an inconvenience by becoming pregnant. Terrified, alone, and unsure of what the future would bring, Grace began to walk down the thoroughfare out of town. She had no idea where she was going, but she knew the town of Canyon would never see her or her child ever again. Chapter 1. 1st of February 1889, Burnett County, Texas. "It's beautiful here, isn't it?" Davina Jensen asked Grace as they sat together on the banks of a creek washing laundry. "It is," Grace agreed. "But it's time to move on before spring comes again, right?" After living with the Jensen family for the last 18 years, Grace had come to appreciate their nomadic ways and how they traveled according to the seasons. "Yes, Texas is too hot in the summer months. Besides, I'm looking forward to seeing my family in Utah again." Davina smiled. Grace returned her smile, and for a moment she was lost in her own thoughts. Neither could attest to being young anymore, and yet they still enjoyed doing most of the chores expected of the women to see to around the camp. "Davina, have I ever thanked you for what you did for me?" Davina stopped rubbing a shirt against her washboard. "I didn't do anything for you." Grace frowned. "Davina, you and your family took in a woman who was 6 months pregnant out of wedlock without questions or judgment. Not a lot of people would have done that." Davina shrugged. "Grace, the Lord guides us where we are needed. He simply guided us to you on that fateful day. Your gratitude should go to him, not to me." "But still, after Simeon was born, you could have turned me away, told me to make my own way, but you didn't." "Why didn't you?" Grace asked curiously. Now that her son Simeon was a grown young man, she finally had the courage to face the past and all the events that brought him into her life. "Because where would you have gone? We always knew that when the time was right, you would move on. And we knew that if you didn't move on, it meant you were meant to be with us. We're like family, Grace." Grace smiled gratefully and reached for Davina's hand. "You have been like family to me, Davina, to both me and Simeon. I don't think I can ever repay you for the kindness you've shown me over almost 2 decades." Davina laughed. "Repay me? You've done more than your share of chores since the first day my husband helped you onto the wagon. If anything, we are in your debt." Grace knew Davina was just being kind. Without the Jensen family, Grace might very well never have survived. After she was turned out of the boarding house 18 years ago, Grace had walked for days, living off nothing but stale bread and whatever food she was able to forage. When Davina and her family came across Grace, they invited her to join their wagon train without question. They hadn't judged her or asked about the paternity of her unborn child, but rather made her feel welcome and supported her until her baby arrived. Once Simeon was born, Grace simply didn't have the courage to leave. 1 year became 2, 2 became 5, and before she knew it, 18 years had come and gone, during which she had traveled with the nomadic family of Mormons. Although Grace had never succumbed to their ways or become a Mormon herself, Grace admired their beliefs and how close to God they lived. Raising her son in their presence had been nothing more than a privilege. Simeon had turned out to be a faithful young man who was not only steadfast in his religion, but a hard worker. Grace knew that was as a direct result of being part of the kind family who had taken them in so many years ago. Simeon would have had numerous other privileges if he had been raised in a town such as Canyon, where he had been conceived. He would have been able to go to school and learn to read, and he would have had more friends than just Davina's children. But Grace wouldn't blame herself for the shortcomings Simeon had suffered. They were healthy and happy, and most of all, they were alive. Something Grace couldn't have been certain would have been the case if Davina and her family hadn't stepped in. "Grace, where is all this coming from?" Davina asked, interrupting Grace's thoughts. Grace shrugged. "I'm not sure. I guess now that Simeon has turned 18, it might be time for us to move on. He's a curious young man. He might have some exploring of his own he'd like to do." "With his mother by his side," Davina teased. Grace laughed. "Perhaps not with his mother by his side, but perhaps he'll visit her often enough. I just have a strange feeling, Davina, like something is going to change. I just don't know what it is." Davina nodded. "God is preparing you for change then, so when it comes, you should accept it." Grace nodded with a smile. She wasn't sure what changes the Lord was preparing her for, but if spending the last 18 years with a Mormon family had taught her one thing, it was to have faith in God's plan for your life. "You're right. But when the change comes, I want you to know that I am grateful for you and your family. I will always keep you and your health in my prayers." Davina smiled brightly. "And we'll keep you in ours." "Good. Now let's get this laundry done so we can start on dinner. I have a feeling the men are going to be tired after taking the cattle out to graze all day." "Yes, they had to go further than usual. My husband says that the land here is becoming overgrazed." "Another reason why you'll move on when spring arrives," Grace added with a smile. As they sat on the banks of the creek washing the laundry, Grace wondered what Davina had meant by change. Was something going to change in her life? Was something going to change for Simeon? Or was it simply time for Grace to think of a future beyond Simeon and the Jensen family? Chapter 2. 20th of February, 1889, Usher Ranch, Canyon, Texas. "We need a new cook," Griswell Usher declared as he dropped his knife and his fork onto his plate with a clang. Jock Usher sat back and shot his son an impatient look across the table. "No, we don't. You need to be grateful for the food on your plate and stop complaining about nonsense." "Jock, Griswell has a very distinguished palate. You can't blame him for enjoying the best food there is on offer." Mel quickly defended her son. Jock glanced at his wife and felt the familiar disappointment bubble through his veins. "There are people who don't have food, people who can't afford anything but moldy bread and cheese, and then you sit here and complain because the standard of the beef isn't to your liking. You're right. I should let the cook go and you can cook your own meals." "Jock, don't be ridiculous. Griswell can't cook. Besides, why do we have to suffer moldy bread and cheese just because you hired a bad cook?" Mel said scathingly. Jock bit his tongue before he suggested his wife attempt cooking for a change. At that very moment, the cook returned to the dining room carrying 3 plates of dessert. A plate was placed in front of Jock. The chocolate cake looked delicious, and the rich scent of cocoa drifted in the air. "Thank you, Consuela," Jock said with a smile. She placed a plate in front of Mel before moving on to Griswell. "I hope you bake a better cake than you grill a piece of steak," Griswell insulted her right to her face. He lifted the piece of steak with a fork and tossed it to his dog, who lay by the door. "Otherwise, my dog will be having dessert as well." Jock's hands fisted on the table. "Griswell, that's enough. Apologize to Consuela." Griswell, at the age of 16, turned to his mother with a look of outrage. "Surely he doesn't mean that, Mother?" "No, of course not, my son. Jock, don't you think you're overreacting a little?" Mel asked, turning to her husband. Jock didn't bother to reply. He shoved his chair back, grabbed his plate of cake, and turned to Consuela. "I'm sorry, Consuela. I'm sure the cake is going to be delicious. I'll have mine on the porch where I can have some peace and quiet to go along with it." With that, Jock turned and walked out of the dining room. He could feel Mel's eyes scouring his back, but he didn't care. He didn't care in the least. Jock was tired of a wife that coddled their grown son as if he were a toddler. A wife who allowed him to be rude, impatient, and disrespectful to anyone and everyone. He was tired of having a son who believed he deserved everything just because he made an effort to grace you with his presence. Jock had tried to intervene in Griswell's upbringing more times than he could remember, but Mel overruled him every time. The result was a son he could barely stand. A son who not only humiliated him, but treated everyone around him as if they were dispensable. Jock sat in the rocker on the porch and drew in a few deep breaths. Although the evening air was still too cool, Jock needed the cold air to calm his hot temper. He had lost his appetite altogether, but he wouldn't offend Consuela even more by not eating the chocolate cake she had prepared for dessert. As he enjoyed the treat, Jock found himself thinking back to another time and another woman. A woman he was sure wouldn't have coddled their son into becoming a spoiled brat. Grace Manch. His heart grew heavy with the memories as they rushed back and overwhelmed him. It had been more than 18 years ago that Jock had fallen in love with the governess of the Barron children. She had made him feel alive, and he had dreamed of a future with her. Although their courtship had been brief, barely a month, Jock had planned on proposing to Grace on Valentine's Day. He had believed that he was meant to have a future with her. But before Jock could act on his feelings and start a future with Grace, she disappeared without leaving a word. No one knew why she had left or where had gone. Not even the Barrons, who had seemed quite fond of their governess, had known why their governess disappeared in the darkness of night. For months, Jock had tried to find Grace, but every attempt had been a failure. Although he had never seen Grace again, Jock often found himself thinking about her. He found himself wondering if his life would have been better with Grace by his side. Marrying Mel DuPont had never been a decision made from love, but rather practicality. After months of searching for Grace, the Barrons had invited Jock to dinner with Mrs. Barron's sister, Mel. They got along well enough, and after seeing each other for a few months, Jock finally realized that he needed to think of his future. He needed an heir for his ranch, and Mel seemed like a good woman. He had asked her to marry him, and their life together had begun. Or rather, nightmare, Jock thought to himself as he took another mouthful of the cake. As soon as she had become Mrs. Jock Usher, Mel had changed completely. Or rather, she had reverted to being the person she had kept hidden during her courtship. Entitled, selfish, and superior to everyone she met, Jock soon realized that she wasn't the woman he had thought her to be. Before Jock could even consider divorce, Mel had surprised him with the news that she was expecting their first child. Caught in a loveless marriage, with a son he could barely stand and a life of extravagance he didn't care for, there was very little that could bring Jock joy these days. Luckily, at times like tonight, there was chocolate cake. Chapter 3. 25th of March, 1889, Burnett County, Texas. Simeon returned with the cattle late in the afternoon. Although he enjoyed herding the cattle to grazing pastures every day, today he would have preferred to stay home at camp. For the last 2 weeks, his mother has been coughing something terrible. Davina had given his mother every flu remedy she knew of, and yet his mother's condition was becoming worse rather than better. Last night, Mr. Jensen had decided that it was time for his mother to see a doctor. Simeon would have preferred to take his mother to the doctor in the nearby town himself, but he knew that he couldn't let Mr. Jensen down now that the cattle were grazing further from camp than ever before. Grazing that far from their camp meant that the cattle were more exposed to cattle wranglers and predators. He knew that Mr. Jensen's son could ward off a coyote or two, but facing a band of cattle thieves was another situation altogether. After tending to his horse, Simeon rushed to the wagon where his mother had been spending most of her time over the last couple of weeks. "Mother? Simeon?" Grace smiled at her son before a bout of coughing overcame her. Simeon waited patiently for her to catch her breath. What did the doctor say? Grace let out a heavy sigh and shook her head. It's consumption, Simeon. I feared it would be that. But that means you won't get better. Simeon trailed off as his heart clenched with fear. Grace smiled sadly. I'm afraid not. Mother, I am so terribly sorry. I can't imagine how frightened you must be, Simeon said, squeezing his mother's hand. Throughout his life, his mother had been his pillar of strength, a plethora of wisdom, and an example of kindness. Simeon simply couldn't imagine living his life without her. I am frightened, but I have you. What more can a mother ask for? Grace smiled. What can I do, Mother? Anything? Simeon asked, noticing his mother's pallor begin to take on the paleness of one with consumption. How hadn't he noticed this before? I've been thinking, Simeon, the Jensens have been terribly kind to us all these years, but I can't burden them with my demise as well. I think it's time we return to Canyon. Grace began to cough again. While his mother coughed, Simeon found himself frowning. His mother had never lied to him about their past. He knew that she was kicked out of her post as a governess for loving his father and had been turned out by a boarding house for being pregnant. Although he didn't know intimate details surrounding his conception, Simeon knew enough to know that his mother had never wanted to go back to Canyon. Canyon? Are you sure, Mother? You said you'll never set your feet in that town again, Simeon asked hesitantly. Grace nodded. A nomadic wagon isn't exactly conducive to my condition. I need you to take me to Canyon. I believe that Elizabeth Barron, my former employer, will take me in. I trust that she'll have enough kindness in her heart after all these years to give me a place to live out my last months. I can take care of you, Mother, Simeon insisted. Grace smiled. I know you will, but first I need you to take me to Canyon. Simeon nodded. We'll leave in the morning. I'll ask Mr. Half Jensen for 2 horses. I'll repay him someday when I can. Do you think you're fit enough to ride? I've never ridden a horse in my life, Grace said, horrified. Then I'll need to ask for a wagon instead of another horse, Simeon thought out loud. I'll pack what we need tonight. You should get some rest. It's at least a 4-day journey. Grace nodded, and Simeon smiled at her one last time before he went in search of Mr. Jensen. Jensen offered Simeon the use of 2 horses and a wagon, saying it was the least he could do. That evening, Simeon spent the last night with the Mormon family who had raised him like their own. Tomorrow, he would take on the responsibility of a man and take his mother to Canyon, Texas. Simeon wasn't sure what awaited them there, but he hoped that his skills as a rider and herder would help him to secure work on a ranch not too far from where his mother would be living out her last days. He prayed for his mother's recovery, but Simeon already knew it would only be a matter of time before the disease consumed her. That was why they had called it consumption, Simeon thought as he sat by the fire. Because it didn't matter what medicine you used. In the end, the disease consumed your entire being until there was nothing left to consume. His heart was heavy knowing his mother's prognosis, but he vowed there and then to take care of her until she breathed her last breath. Chapter 4. 28th of March, 1889. Usher Ranch, Canyon, Texas. Although Jock had become a rancher through breeding cattle, his ranch had diversified over the years. Instead of just breeding cattle, they now bred quarter horses as well. Until recently, Jock had been the only person on the ranch to break in the young horses. But with age came other challenges. Jock wasn't the young man he used to be, and he hoped that now that his time was over, Griswell would take the lead. Over the last week, he had been in the training ring with Griswell every single day. He taught his son how to bond with a horse, how to gain its trust, and how to entice it to be loyal without using force or punishment of any kind. Jock had learned that when you punished a horse, you never gained its trust. And if your horse didn't trust you, you couldn't trust your horse to bring you home safely. Trust between man and horse was the most important bond a person could have in the rough terrain of the West. This morning, Jock had decided to give Griswell a little more responsibility by not joining him in the horse ring. Instead, Jock had ridden out to check on the cattle while Griswell worked a little more on the horse he was trying to break in. He returned around lunchtime to find a group of ranch hands surrounding the horse ring. waving their hats and calling out bets as if they were at a rodeo instead of on the Usher Ranch. "What's going on here?" Jock demanded as he slipped out of his saddle with ease. One of the older ranch hands nodded towards the horse ring. "Your boy has decided to try some tricks of his own with that filly." Jock glanced through the crowd and saw Griswell standing in the center of the ring with a whip. The horse's rear was already marked with lashings, indicating the whip had been used more than a few times in Jock's absence. Anger pulsed through Jock's veins as he made his way through the ranch hands and stepped into the ring. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Jock demanded from Griswell. Griswell turned to him with a maleficent grin. "Teaching this stupid animal who's the boss around here." "Is that so?" Jock was seething. "And what exactly did that earn you? Her trust or her hatred?" "I don't need it to trust me. I need it to listen to me." Griswell shrugged without any empathy for the horse at all. "That's not the way we train horses on the Usher Ranch, and you know it." Jock seethed. He grabbed the whip from Griswell and tossed it out of the ring. "You want to be a big, strong rancher? Go ahead. You try and touch that filly now without your whip?" Griswell scoffed and walked towards the horse, cockier than a man with two loaded guns in a single gun fight. The moment the horse realized Griswell no longer had the whip, she began to charge. Dust flew up in the ring as Griswell raced to the side and slipped through just before the horse could trample him. He stood up on the other side, glaring at Jock with nothing but hatred and anger in his eyes. "That dang horse could have killed me," Griswell shouted at Jock, with all the ranch hands watching. Jock nodded. "It would have been her right to do so. You harm an animal on this ranch again, and I'll take a whip to you." Griswell cursed under his breath as he took off his hat and tossed it to a nearby ranch hand. "Go wash my hat." The ranch hand caught the hat, frowning at Griswell's demand. "Now," Griswell shouted even louder. "Or do you need me to pick up the whip before you listen as well?" Jock was humiliated by his son's behavior. He couldn't believe that the mean-spirited boy was of his blood. He took no pride in his son's manner or the way he treated the ranch hands. "You can wash your own darn hat." The ranch hand tossed the hat back to Griswell. Griswell caught it just in time and turned to Jock with a scathing look. "This isn't over, old man. You won't be here forever to protect your darn horses." For the first time in his life, Jock wanted to punch another man. He wanted to take a fist to his own son. He had never suffered such defiance or entitlement in his life, and he knew it was a direct result of Mel's coddling. As Griswell skulked back to the house with his tail between his legs, Jock glanced around the ring at the ranch hands who were still standing there. "Show's over, boys. Back to work." Jock took a step towards the horse, but the horse immediately took a step back. Griswell's mean-spirited performance had just cost him a week spent gaining the horse's trust. As his son, Jock knew he had to include his son in some part of the operation of the ranch. But right now, he wasn't sure that Griswell would ever be the gentleman rancher that Jock had hoped he would become. There wasn't a single ranch hand who would respect Griswell after his show of strength in the horse ring, and Jock couldn't even blame them. Griswell might be his son, but right now, he was nothing more to Jock than a constant disappointment. A heavy sigh escaped Jock as he reached into his pocket for the sugar cubes he always carried on him. He would deal with his son later. He had a horse to take care of first. At least he knew for the horse there was hope. Chapter 5, 29th of March, 1889, Barren Ranch, Canyon, Texas. "Is this where you worked?" Simeon asked in surprise as he pulled up to the large ranch house outside of town. Grace nodded. "Yes, for 3 years. It's beautiful, isn't it? Imposing but welcoming at the same time." Simeon shook his head. "I'd say intimidating, rather. It's like the mansions of the East Coast you hear about, set against the vast backdrop of Texas fields." "Exactly." Grace began to climb down from the wagon. Over the last few days, she had begun to feel a little better. She wasn't sure if it was the traveling or the medicine the doctor had given her, but she was grateful for the brief reprieve from coughing. Her body ached from the intense bouts of coughing she had been suffering. "Come, let's go see if Elizabeth Barron is home." "Mother, are you sure about this? I told you that I'd take care of you." Simeon insisted one last time. Grace shook her head. How are you to find a job as a ranch hand if you've got your mother with you? It won't work, and you know it. Together, they approached the front door. Simeon couldn't help but feel slightly intimidated by the imposing house. It was as if even the house issued a warning to those who were outside of the upper-class society enjoyed by its residents. Grace knocked on the door, and Simeon waited anxiously, hearing the footsteps approaching. He felt underdressed for the occasion, although it wasn't an occasion at all. A housekeeper, dressed in a maid's uniform, opened the door. "Good afternoon? Millie, is that you?" Grace asked hopefully. It took a moment for the housekeeper to recognize his mother, but when she did, she opened her arms and welcomed Grace into her embrace. "Grace, I thought I'd never see you again. We were all so worried when you took off in the night." Grace bit her tongue, refusing to let the memories of the past ruin the possibility of taking the burden from her son's hands of caring for her on her deathbed. "It's so good to see you too, Millie. This is my son, Simeon. Is Mrs. Barron home, perhaps?" "Of course, come inside. You head on into the sitting room, and I'll fetch her for you." Millie let them in before she headed upstairs to summon Mrs. Barron. While they waited, Simeon couldn't help but be flabbergasted by the display of wealth inside the house. Even the fireplace had gold etchings. The ceilings were high, and the furniture was not the type of campsite furniture with which he had been raised. A short while later, they heard footsteps approaching. Grace stood up with a kind smile. "Mrs. Barron, it's been such a long time, and yet it doesn't seem like you've aged a single day. It's so good to see you." Elizabeth Barron's eyes widened with horror before they quickly glazed over with indifference. Grace had feared this would be the case, but as this had been her only hope, she had prayed that it would be different. "I'm sorry, do I know you?" Mrs. Barron asked, seemingly bored. "Yes, it's me, Grace Manch. I was governess to your children for 3 years," Grace reminded her with a smile. Mrs. Barron shook her head, completely unaffected by the information. "I'm sorry. You must be mistaking me for someone else. I've never met you, and if you had been governess to my children, I'm sure I would have remembered. Millie, please show them out." With that, Elizabeth Barron turned on her heel and walked away. For a moment, Grace just stood in place, shocked at Mrs. Barron's blatant indifference and the coldness with which she delivered it. Millie rushed to her side. "That's odd. How could she have forgotten you?" Grace shook her head. "She didn't. She simply doesn't want me here. That's all." Prosody rate %. "Mother, what are we going to do now?" Simeon asked, concerned. He turned to Millie and explained, "My mother is suffering from consumption. I have nowhere to take her. I have to find work as a ranch hand, but without wages, I won't be able to care for her at all." "Wait here," Millie said before she quickly rushed away. When she returned a few moments later, she handed Grace an envelope. "This will pay for your lodging at the boarding house for at least a few weeks. I can't give you more, but I hope that helps." Grace thanked Millie before she and Simeon were shown outside. As soon as they were in the wagon, Simeon turned to his mother with a curious look. "What aren't you telling me, Mother? Why did she pretend not to know you?" Grace shrugged with a heavy sigh. "Some people never seek redemption. They'd rather pretend that they didn't do wrong at all than welcome a chance to make things right." Simeon let out a sigh. "I guess we're going to the boarding house then?" "Yes. I'll try to think of something in the morning. Right now, I'm exhausted." Grace flinched as the wagon bumped over a rock. She didn't want to be a burden to Simeon, but she couldn't stay with the Jensens and be a burden to them. For the first time in her life, Grace wished she had already been called home to the pearly gates. Millie's kindness would buy them time, but it wouldn't give them a permanent solution. "I'll try to find work tomorrow. Perhaps if I get a position as a ranch hand, I can pay for your stay in the boarding house. At least I know you won't be alone." Grace smiled at her son, not wanting him to know that the boarding house was the last place she wanted to be. She had been tossed out 18 years ago, simply for being pregnant. She couldn't imagine what they would do if they learned she was suffering from consumption. Chapter 6. 5th of April, 1889, Canyon, Texas. The day after Grace and Simeon checked into the boarding house, Grace's condition regressed. She had spent the last 3 days in bed, struggling to catch her breath between bouts of coughing. The only thing she could be grateful for at the moment was that the previous owner of the boarding house was no longer there, so at least they hadn't been turned away. This morning, Simeon had ridden out once more to try to find work as a ranch hand. Grace was tired of sitting in her room all day, after a week of doing just that, and decided that a stroll down the thoroughfare would be in order. It had been a little more than 18 years since she had been in Canyon, and it was fascinating to her how the town had developed and changed over the years. She perused the new dress shop that hadn't been there before, and even treated herself to a long stroll through the general mercantile store. It was evident that the town of Canyon had boomed during her absence. After an hour of enjoying the new sights in Canyon, Grace was ready to return to the boarding house to rest. The fact that she became exhausted after such little exercise was another indication that her health was failing. Faster than she had anticipated it would. She had barely laid down her hat when there was a knock at the door. A frown creased her brow, wondering who it might be. Simeon had paid up front for the first 2 weeks, so it wouldn't be the owner demanding his money. Tentatively, Grace opened the door and found herself taking a step back as she recognized the man before her. "It is you," he said without introduction. He stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. "I couldn't be sure, but now I am. Goodness, Grace, how wonderful it is to see you, to know that you're here and in good health." Grace struggled to find words. She had imagined this moment for so long that now that it had finally arrived, she was completely caught off guard. "Jock? Well, at least you still remember my name," Jock said with a handsome smile. "What are you doing here?" Grace asked, glancing around the room. Simeon would return any moment now, and the last thing she needed was for him to find Jock there. He still didn't know who his father was, and Grace wasn't about to tell him now. "What am I doing here? I've always lived here. I saw you on the thoroughfare. For a moment I thought my eyes were deceiving me. But I would recognize you in a sandstorm in the middle of a desert, Grace," Jock said, with a loving smile. Grace's heart skipped a beat. She was so angry at him, and yet she couldn't seem to find her anger now. There was so much she wanted to ask him and needed to tell him, and yet she wasn't even sure where to begin. "I think you'd better sit down." Jock sat down on the chair by the writing desk and took off his hat. "When did you come back?" "A week ago," Grace admitted. "Why didn't you come to see me?" "Why should I have come to see you? After Elizabeth Barron tossed me out like garbage, I was sure you would never want to see me again." Jock frowned. "She tossed you out. I thought you ran away." "Jock, how could I have run away when I had nowhere to go?" Grace asked weakly. "Elizabeth had me removed from her house and sent me here to work in the boarding house. I wasn't allowed to even leave the boarding house. It was like being in jail. She told me that I was standing in the way of your future with Mel, her sister." Jock cursed under his breath. "Really? Why would I lie after so many years? I left when the boarding house owner learned I was pregnant. He tossed me out on the street without a dollar to my name. That's when I knew it was time to leave town." "Prosody didn't you come to me?" Jock demanded. "I thought you'd come looking for me. When you didn't, I accepted that you never really loved me at all." Jock stood up and pulled Grace into his arms. He didn't kiss her, but only held her tight. "How could you have thought that when I was ready to ask you to be my wife?" Grace broke free. "I didn't know." "Where have you been all these years?" Jock asked, searching her eyes. Grace drew in a deep breath before she met his gaze. "Raising your son with the help of a family of nomadic Mormons." Jock's eyes widened with surprise. "I have a son? Yes, his name is Simeon, and he doesn't know about you. He'll be back any moment, so you have to leave." "No." Jock shook his head. "I'm not going anywhere until I know more about my son. How old is he?" 18. Grace smiled sadly. "I never told him you were his father. I won't offend you now by telling him the truth. I'm sure you have a family of your own by now." Jock clenched his fists. "I married Mel. We have a son, Griswell." Grace scoffed. "I should have known." "Known what?" "Known that I pined for you. And when I couldn't find you, I finally gave up." known that Mel would have been forced on me, and I would have only realized how marrying her was a mistake when it was too late? How could either of us have known that was where life would lead us? Jock demanded. I wanted a life with you, Grace. Grace's heart swelled in her chest. She had longed to hear those very words, but it was too late now that she was dying. She couldn't offer Jock anything, but she could hope that he would look out for his son. She explained about her illness and Simeon's search for a job as a ranch hand. After learning everything that was happening in Grace's life, Jock simply shook his head. You don't have to be concerned anymore. Tell Simeon to come by my ranch in the morning. Tell him an old friend of yours has offered him a job as a stable hand. I can't tell Mel that he's my son, but I'll take care of him. And as for you, consider your room here paid for until you no longer need it. I'll send word to the doctor as well that I'll be paying for all your treatments. It's the least I can do after you raised our son alone. Gratitude washed over Grace. Thank you, Jock. I really wish things could have been different. Jock reached for the door to leave, but not before he turned back and met her gaze. I never stopped loving you, Grace. I've wished for that every single day. Chapter 7. 6th of April, 1889, Canyon, Texas. Grace waited all day for Simeon to return. When she told him the night before that she had run into an old friend and managed to find him work as a ranch hand, Simeon had been overcome with relief. Grace hadn't told Simeon any more than that Jock had been a good friend a long time ago. She didn't tell him that Jock had been the love of her life or that he was Simeon's father. But she did reassure her son that he no longer had to concern himself with her rent at the boarding house, as Jock had offered to take care of that as part of Simeon's remuneration package. If Simeon found Jock's kindness a little strange, he hadn't mentioned it. It was almost 7 o'clock at night before Simeon finally stepped into the room. Grace couldn't help but smile at the sight of her son. He looked happier than he had ever looked in his life. Whatever had happened on the Usher Ranch today had erased the shadows of concern from his eyes. I take it you had a good first day on the Usher Ranch? Grace asked with a smile. Simeon shook his head as he took off his hat. Mother, when you said Jock Usher had a ranch, you didn't say it was the biggest, most magnificent ranch I've ever laid eyes on. The man's cattle are uncountable, and the horse breeding operation he has going on, Mother, you should see those horses. The finest specimens I've ever laid eyes on. Grace didn't comment. Instead, she couldn't help but be a little surprised by how much success Jock had achieved since she had last seen him. I'm grateful you like the ranch and the work. What did you do today? Not much, to be honest, Simeon said, sitting down at the writing desk. Jock introduced me to all the ranch hands and to his son, Griswell. He showed me around, introduced me to some of their horses, and then, Mother, he took me to see my cabin. I have a cabin, Mother. It's not much, just basically one big room with a bed, a chair, and a small wood stove, but as long as I work for Jock, it's mine. Grace's heart swelled with joy. To know that her son would be provided for when she was gone was a relief to her troubled soul. That sounds nice. Yes, it is. Jock insists I live on the ranch. He says it's too much trouble to have his ranch hands living in town. Since there isn't room in the bunkhouse, I get the cabin. Simeon shook his head, flabbergasted by his luck. A bout of coughing overcame Grace. She tried to catch her breath, but the coughing simply wouldn't subside. When she finally pulled her hand from her mouth, she hid the red stain on her handkerchief from Simeon. I take it you'll be moving to the ranch tomorrow? Yes, that's the plan. I'll come visit you as often as I can, Mother. Jock said he's going to start me out as a stable boy until I understand the whole operation, but I don't mind working in the stables. I've always loved working with horses, and if I'm a stable boy, perhaps I can learn more about the breeding operation he has going on. Simeon was jabbering a mile a minute. He also mentioned he needs someone to help him break in the young horses. Some of the other ranch hands told me that his son Griswell doesn't really have a touch when it comes to horses, or livestock for that matter. That's odd, given how wonderful his father is with animals, Grace observed with a frown. Mother, if I didn't know Griswell was Jock's son, I would have never believed it. He's nothing like Jock. Simeon shook his head. Why would you say that? Grace asked curiously. I might not know Jock very well, but he seems to be a kind man who values his ranch hands and his livestock. Griswell seems to detest both. It's clear the ranch hands don't like him very much. Prosody Ray 7%. Grace couldn't help but be surprised. She couldn't believe that Jock's son could be anything but kind and generous like his father was. But then she reminded herself, who was Griswell's mother? If Mel was anything like her sister, Elizabeth Barron, it wasn't all that hard to believe. I'm sorry to hear that. Just remember to treat him with the respect he deserves for being Jock's son, Grace reminded her son. Simeon chuckled. Mother, how could I do anything else? You've raised me right. For a woman facing the end, those were the words Grace treasured the most. I love you, Simeon. Always remember that. Simeon scoffed. As if I can forget. I'm going downstairs to get some supper. Will you join me? Grace wished she had the energy, but she was simply feeling too ill to do anything more than cough. No, you go on ahead. I ate earlier. She lied with a smile. The moment Simeon left the room, Grace let out a heavy sigh. It was hard to pretend she was fine when her lungs were burning. Her body was aching, and just the thought of food made her stomach churn. It was time she accepted that her disease was finally doing what it was known for. It was consuming her. Chapter 8. 18th of April, 1889, Canyon, Texas. Simeon stood over his mother's grave, his heart heavy with loss. He had known that the consumption would mean her end, but he had thought he would have more time with her. He had thought that it would take months before the disease claimed her life, but it had only been a matter of weeks. The pastor, whom he had only met the day before, had said some very kind words over his mother's grave. Simeon wished more people had turned up to honor and celebrate his mother's life, but he stood alone, a solitary mourner. He was no longer a child, and now, as a man, he realized how hard it must have been for his mother to raise him without the support of a husband. Simeon had the greatest respect for his mother and couldn't help but hope that one day he could become the man she hoped he would be. A strong and kind man, a generous man with an even temper, a man who would not only support his family but everyone he meets. Standing over his mother's grave, Simeon vowed to live up to her expectations. He knew it was time to leave and time to return to his work at the Usher Ranch. But Simeon couldn't seem to move. Throughout his life, his mother had been his driving force, his encouragement, and his voice of reason. How was he to move on without her? Simeon didn't care about the money he had borrowed from Jock to arrange for the funeral or the pastor. He would pay that back in time. His mother deserved a proper burial and the extravagant flowers he had put on her grave. He only wished he could have afforded to spoil her in much the same way when she had been alive. A heavy sigh escaped him. Goodbye, Mother. Rest in peace, and know that I will endeavor every day to be a man you can be proud of. As Simeon turned to leave his mother's grave, he noticed a figure coming out of the trees in the distance. A frown creased his brow as he recognized his employer, Jock. I'm sorry, Mr. Usher, I was just on my way back to the ranch, Simeon apologized when Jock reached him. Jock's eyes were filled with sympathy. I didn't come here to remind you to make it quick, Simeon. I came here to pay my respects to your mother. The ranch can wait. Simeon felt a smile curve his mouth that at least an old friend had come to his mother's funeral. Thank you for coming, Mr. Usher. She would have appreciated your presence. When we're alone, Simeon, please call me Jock, Jock said with a sad smile. I wish I could have done more. Jock trailed off. You did more than she ever expected by taking care of her fees at the boarding house, Jock. Without your generosity, I shudder to imagine where she would have spent her last weeks. Simeon reminded Jock. Jock stepped forward and rested a hand on Simeon's shoulder. I know I can never take the place of your mother, Simeon, but I want you to know that if you ever need anything, I am here for you. All you have to do is ask. Simeon nodded gratefully. Thank you, Jock. Good. Now that we've settled that, how about we go pour one out for your mother in the saloon? Simeon's eyes widened with surprise. You want to go to the saloon now? Yes, neither of us will be of any use at the ranch. Besides, it looks like you could use a drink. Simeon had never been to a saloon before, and the only time he had ever touched his lips to alcohol, it had tasted foul. I'm not much of a drinker. It's on me. Don't worry about the cost, Jock assured Simeon with a slap on the back. It's not about the cost. It's the taste I have a problem with. Simeon chuckled as they each mounted their horse. By the third drink, the taste won't bother you anymore, Jock laughed. 2 hours later, Jock and Simeon sat in the saloon, each nursing their first drink. Instead of pouring himself into grief over the loss of his mother, Simeon found Jock's conversation more intriguing than the alcohol. Simeon was surprised at how much alike they were when it came to their outlook on the future of the ranch. Just like Jock, Simeon believed in the breeding of quarter horses. You mentioned on my first day that you're looking to hand over the reins of breaking in the young horses. Who do you have in mind for that? Simeon asked, slightly hopeful. Jock's eyes narrowed with curiosity. Are you saying you'd be interested? I would be. I've broken in quite a few horses over the years. I enjoy the challenge, but I enjoy the reward of earning a horse's trust even more, Simeon explained. Jock's eyes narrowed even more. The horse's trust, you say? And how exactly do you break in a young horse? Simeon shrugged. Being raised in a nomadic community, I learned different ways of breaking in a horse, but the Indian way is still the one I believe in the most. It takes a lot of time and patience, but in the end, it's worth the wait. You start by introducing yourself to the horse, allowing the horse to realize you're not a threat. Then over the course of a few days, you start to earn his trust until that very first ride. Of course, he'll try to buck you off faster than you can count to 5, but if you hold on long enough, you become one with the horse. Simeon chuckled, feeling foolish. Certainly a big rancher like Jock didn't have time to coax a horse into trusting him. Jock shook his head with a baffled expression. That is exactly how I prefer to break my horses. The job is yours. You've just been promoted to horse trainer. Simeon's eyes widened with joy. Really? Wait, you're not just doing this because you feel sorry for me after losing my mother? Jock shook his head. I've never made decisions concerning my ranch out of pity. I'm giving you the position because I believe that at the heart of the matter, we appreciate the same outcome, the horse's well-being. Simeon lifted his glass and took a sip. The alcohol burned down his throat, the taste still foul. He might not ever get used to the taste of liquor, but at least he would be a horse trainer. He glanced at Jock and felt a yearning for the first time in his life. He had never yearned for a father, but now he couldn't help but wish that he had been raised by a man like Jock Usher. Chapter 9. 20th of July, 1889. Usher Ranch, Canyon, Texas. Simeon stepped into the horse ring with a mare he had been working on for the last week. Jock had bought her at an auction in Fort Worth, and although her bloodlines were crucial to the breeding program at the Usher Ranch, both Simeon and Jock agreed that it would be beneficial to them to break her in first. The mare sensed him from the other side of the ring and turned to look at him as he closed the gate behind him. Good morning, Grace, Simeon greeted her with a smile. With Jock's permission, he had named the beautiful mare after his mother. I have some sugar cubes if you're interested. Simeon held the cubes on his outstretched hand, and the mare tentatively began to move towards him. You're wasting my father's money on all those sugar cubes. It's time you mounted the mare and got it over with, Griswell commented from the side of the ring. These sugar cubes you think I'm wasting will be the reason this mare won't leave you on your butt in the dirt when a mountain lion comes for your cattle. It makes her loyal, Simeon explained curtly. He had come to realize over the last 3 months why all the ranch hands despised Griswell. It wasn't his mean temper or his elitist manner when handling everyone. It was the mean way in which he treated the animals. In Simeon's point of view, a man can defend himself, but a horse kept in a stable wasn't able to defend itself from a whip. He still remembered that day a month ago when he had found Griswell whipping his horse in the stables for bucking him off. Simeon had gone straight to Jock and had made it clear that Griswell was no longer welcome at the stables. Simeon, you proved me wrong last night, Jock said, stepping up onto the first rung of the horse ring. I was sure that mare in labor was going to lose the foal. I was almost convinced we were going to lose the mare as well. I see both mare and foal are doing well this morning. Simeon shrugged. It was her first foal. She was just a little overwhelmed. As soon as I managed to calm her down, she allowed me to help her with the foal. Helping a mare foal? Jock chuckled. That's a first on Usher Ranch. If we plan on breeding, it won't be the last, Simeon said with a smile before he stroked a hand down Grace's back. The mare no longer flinched at his touch, but instead seemed to enjoy it. You like that, Grace, don't you? The mare nickered as if answering him. You've got a touch I ain't never seen before. Jock reveled at the sight. He might have a touch, but he ain't broken her in just yet. She's gonna buck him right over the ring if you ask me, Griswell scoffed. Simeon would have wanted to take another day or two to prepare the mare for his first ride, but Griswell's words made anger bubble through his veins. Without giving it a second thought, Simeon grabbed the horse's mane and vaulted onto her back. For a moment, she was so shocked that she did nothing but stand still. When that moment was over, she began to race around the ring, with Simeon holding on for dear life, knowing that if he let go now, he would need to start all over again. He had a firm grip and was grateful that she wasn't trying to buck him off, simply frighten him with speed. But speed had never frightened Simeon before. Open the gate, he demanded of Griswell. Griswell's eyes were as wide as saucers. Griswell, do as you're told, Jock scolded his son. Griswell opened the gate, and the horse headed right for it. As soon as they were through the gate, Simeon felt that familiar freedom wash over him as the wind tugged at his hat, and the mare let loose. Prosody. Laughter could be heard in the wind as he rode her until she stopped to catch her breath. Simeon leaned over and brushed a hand down the side of her neck. You proved him wrong, didn't you, Grace? The horse whinnied as if she was proud of herself for proving Griswell wrong. Come on, let's go back and show them what a fine mount you make. As Simeon trotted back into the ring on Grace's back, no one was more surprised than Griswell. Simeon knew it was wrong of him to taunt Griswell, but he couldn't seem to help it. Might want to budget for more sugar cubes. Seems to be working just fine. Jock and the ranch hands laughed as Simeon slid off Grace's back. He handed her a few more sugar cubes before he stepped out of the ring. The ranch hands all congratulated him, but it was Jock's look of approval that made the dangerous ride worth every single second. He might not be Jock's son, but Jock had already become like a father to him, the father he never had. Chapter 10. 15th of February, 1892, Chicago, Illinois. I swear I can't take this weather anymore. When it's not freezing, the wind is trying to whip you into a different state, Carol Bloom announced as she walked into the apartment. Dee Wilkins laughed in agreement. That's why we're seeking greener pastures down south. I know, and I pray every night that one day I'll open a letter and there will be a proposal waiting for me. Can you imagine it, Dee? Traveling to Texas, marrying a handsome rancher, and never having to face this terrible weather or sly skeetle ever again. Carol flopped down on the couch. Dee's eyes softened with sympathy. Don't tell me you ran into him as well? Carol nodded. It doesn't matter which stairs I take or what time I come home. It's as if he's always there, ready to ogle and make inappropriate comments. Today, he was loitering on the east stairway. He had the gall to tell me that he could wipe the frown off my face by taking me back to his apartment for a few minutes. When I shot him down, he was furious. Told me that a buttoned-up, tight-lipped girl like me is going to get what she's asking for. It was as good as a threat. Dee gasped with horror. Did he actually say that to you? Yes, Carol said, outraged. The man is a lunatic and a nuisance to society. Is it wrong of me to hope he catches consumption? Dee shook her herd. She knew exactly how Dee felt. Their landlord Sly Skeetle had an ominous reputation at best. At worst, there were rumors that his wife had not run away, but that Sly had caused her to disappear. Living up to his name, Sly was as sly as a fox, as cunning as a raccoon, and had a way of undressing women with his eyes. The only reason Dee and Carol hadn't moved was that they wouldn't get the same size apartment anywhere else for the rent they were paying. Both Dee and Carol were raised in Chicago. Both came from the same orphanage and had attended school together. When Dee managed to get a position at a dress shop and Carol found employment at a bank, They were both eager to leave the orphanage for good. They moved into this apartment together 2 years ago and hadn't looked back since. Neither had any family, but to each other, they were like sisters. Although the rent was cheap, there were days when Dee felt that Sly's ogling and rancid comments were more taxing than paying higher rent. "Maybe we should just cut down on expenses and find another place," Carol finally said. Dee shook her head. "Let's give it a few more months first. Hopefully by that time we're both engaged and off to the west to be married." Carol smiled hopefully. "I still can't believe how lucky we were. When we decided to write to two ranchers, both living in Texas, I honestly didn't think anything would come of it. And now, we might just get lucky and marry them and only live a few hours away from each other." "I know," Dee said excitedly. "Finally, we'll be able to have a little more adventure in our lives than helping a socialite choose the right dress or helping a wealthy banker write a check." Speaking of wealthy bankers, there was a man in the bank today who was complaining about his wife. He came in to see to it that she no longer had access to his accounts. Apparently, she's a bit of a spender and managed to spend a year's worth of our wages in a single afternoon, shopping with her friends. A bit of a spender. I'd say she's downright spoiled to spend that much money in one afternoon. Doesn't she realize that there are people in this city who don't even have homes? Dee shook her head. "I don't care how much money Chip has. I will never be that extravagant with money. It just isn't necessary," Carol pointed out. "Before you start planning on not spending Chip's money, maybe you should wait for a proposal first," Dee teased. Carol laughed. "That would be wise, but how can I not dream about the life we're going to have? I know we've only been corresponding for a few months, Dee, but I'm certain that I'm going to be his wife. I can feel it in my heart, you know. It just feels right." Dee smiled, happy for her friend. "I'm sure you will." "When's the last time you heard from your grizzly bear?" Carol asked with a teasing look. Dee shook her head. "He isn't a grizzly bear. His name is Griswell Usher, named for his maternal grandfather, I'll have you know, and I actually received a letter from him today. I can't believe we've been corresponding for 4 months already." "I know, me and Chip as well," Dee nodded. "Perhaps this time next year we'll both be the wives of cattle ranchers." "You mean your grizzly bear has already won over your heart?" Carol laughed. Dee rolled her eyes. "Perhaps. It's early days still. But I like him. He seems humble in his letters." "I'm sure he is," Carol agreed. "Enough dreaming about the future. What are we going to have for supper?" Dee asked, joining Carol on the couch. Carol shrugged. "Dreams of the future sounds like a perfect menu for me. Do you think you'll enjoy living on a ranch?" Dee laughed, but made herself comfortable. Carol was right. Why bother with something as boring as cooking supper when they could dream about their lives as ranchers' wives? Chapter 11. 20th of February, 1892, Usher Ranch, Canyon, Texas. The entire town had come out to the cemetery to pay their last respects. Simeon couldn't remember seeing so many people gathered in one place at a time. Some wore black, some wore hats, and some, like Mel, wore an extravagant lace dress in black to mourn the passing of her husband. Although the veil over her face obscured his view somewhat, Simeon could see that her sobs were dry-eyed theatrics. Over the last 2 years, Simeon had come to love and respect Jock. He had learned more from the rancher than he had ever imagined there was to learn. Through training horses and being away for weeks at a time on cattle drives, Simeon and Jock had become good friends. When the lead ranch hand left the year before to start a ranch of his own, Simeon had taken his place. Griswell had made no secret of the fact that he didn't like Simeon. Simeon wasn't sure why, but he didn't let Griswell's miserable demeanor affect him or his responsibilities on the ranch. Instead, Simeon focused on learning more and making sure Jock didn't regret assigning him the position. Although Jock had never spoken ill of his family in any way, Simeon had noticed over the years that he had a very strained relationship with his wife. There was little affection and plenty of arguments, which were always started by Mel. Just once, Jock had confided in Simeon that he feared he had married the wrong woman. It had been after a long day and a few beers, and Jock had never mentioned it again. But from that day on, Simeon had noticed that the relationship between Jock and Mel wasn't what he imagined a healthy marriage to be. His suspicions had been confirmed a few days ago when he had been the one to share the devastating news of Jock's passing with his family. They had moved the cattle between pastures and had spent the night in the field. Jock hadn't had any complaints the night before, but the following morning he simply never woke up. Simeon knew that would have been the way Jock would have wanted to go, resting peacefully under a tree, surrounded by his cattle and nature. A shiver traveled down Simeon's spine as the memory haunted him. Simeon had returned from the cattle drive late in the afternoon. He had approached the porch with a heavy feeling, hating to be the one bearing bad news. It had been Mel who had opened the door. "What?" she demanded irritably. Simeon took off his hat and held it against his chest. "I'm sorry for bothering, ma'am, but I come bearing bad news. Jock passed away in his sleep last night. I've instructed the ranch hands to bring him home. I'm sure you would like to arrange for a proper burial." Simeon had expected her to cry or to collapse. Even fainting would have been acceptable, but her dry-eyed, cocked brow look was accompanied with a shrug. "Could you just have buried him in the field?" Simeon had taken a step back. "Ma'am?" "Fine, we'll give him a burial. Griswell," she called into the house. Griswell joined her a few seconds later. "Yes, Mother? Your father died. You need to arrange a funeral. The ranch is yours now. Make sure you're not as frugal about my spending as your father was." Mel instructed Griswell before she turned and walked away. "Was there anything else?" Griswell demanded of Simeon, as if Simeon had just told him about a broken fence. No," Simeon said, baffled by their reaction. "Then I suggest you get back to work. I don't pay you to stand around on my porch," Griswell said with a malevolent grin. Simeon had headed to the barn to wait for the men who were bringing Jock home, wondering if the family would mourn in private. But he couldn't help but feel disturbed by their cold reaction to the news. Jock hadn't even been Simeon's family, and he was devastated by the loss. Now, as he stood over Jock's grave, Simeon wondered if there had been more to Jock's words that night when he had said he feared he had married the wrong woman. Had his marriage been an unhappy one? Had his relationship with his son been strained? He couldn't imagine why, since Jock had been such a kind person and so easy to get along with. He watched as Jock's coffin was lowered into the ground, and while everyone was looking at the coffin, Simeon found himself looking at Mel and Griswell. Were they smiling? Simeon wasn't sure why they would be smiling, but he had an eerie feeling that they were relieved that Jock had passed. He pushed the thoughts far from his mind and paid his last respects to a man who was the closest thing to a father he had ever had in his entire life. One day, he hoped that he could be like Jock, not wealthy or the owner of a large cattle ranch, but he hoped to be wise, considerate, kind, and generous to everyone he met, because that was what he would always remember about Jock Usher. Chapter 12. 20th of March, 1892, Chicago, Illinois. Carol trotted up to the steps to their apartment, wondering what Dee had done all day. It wasn't often that Dee got a day off from working at the dress shop, but after working late every night the week before, the owner had insisted she deserved a day of rest. It was dusk as Carol tried to unlock the door of the apartment, only to find it unlocked. She frowned as she let herself in, knowing that Dee was very meticulous about keeping it locked, especially when she was alone at home. "I'm home," Carol called out as she put her purse on the table. Dee didn't answer her. As Carol moved into the living room, she immediately knew that something was very wrong. The coffee table was overturned, the curtain railing was pulled down on one side, and pieces of broken glass from a shattered ornament lay strewn about. Carol's heart began to pump with fear as she scoured the apartment for her friend. Dee! She rushed to Dee's bedroom and saw the bed covered with tangled sheets and a spot of blood. "Dee," Carol said breathlessly, fearing the worst. As she moved around the bed, she heard a stifled whimpering from the bathroom. She found Dee sitting in the tub, covered with a blanket and nothing else. Her one eye was purple and bruised, her lips split, and there was a large bump on her head. "Dee, what happened?" Sly was all Dee could manage before she began to quietly sob once more. A few hours later, after the law enforcement had left, Carol made them each a cup of tea and joined Dee in her bedroom. They had shut Dee's bedroom door, and Carol knew it would be a long time before either of them would be able to sleep in there again. The law enforcement had mercilessly questioned Dee with regard to Sly's attack. Not only had he attacked Dee and beat her to a pulp, but he had taken her innocence as well. Carol had held her friend as she cried and relived the nightmare, only to learn that the law enforcement weren't really interested in apprehending Sly at all. According to them, Sly was an upstanding citizen and would never reduce himself to such a misdemeanor. They wouldn't offend him by questioning him about the events of that afternoon. Neither Dee nor Carol had bothered to argue, knowing that Sly probably paid the law off to look the other way. That was probably how his wife simply disappeared, and why there were so many apartments that became available every month. This wasn't the first or the last time that Sly Skeetle had abused one of his tenants. "Here you go, honey," Carol said, climbing into bed with her friend. She had helped Dee take a bath and dressed her in comfortable pajamas before putting her in bed. For supper, she had made chicken soup, knowing that Dee wouldn't be able to chew with her bruised jaw and split lip. "It will be all right. I promise we'll find another apartment as soon as we can." Dee sighed heavily. "Do you know what's been bothering me since he left?" "What, honey?" Carol asked, wrapping a protective arm around Dee's shoulders. "How could God let this happen? How could he allow men like Sly to walk the earth? They say he has a plan for all of us, but if this was his plan for me, then I fear what he has in mind for my future." Dee trailed off before a fresh wave of tears overcame her. "Don't think like that, Dee. God can lead us in the direction he wants us to go, but the devil can make us stray. Sly is led by the devil, not God. So seek your consolation in the Lord and trust that one day Sly will get his deserved justice," Carol assured her. "I never should have opened the door. I didn't know it was him. I was cleaning and preoccupied and didn't even stop to ask who it was," Dee sobbed. "Don't think about it anymore. You need to rest up," Carol said with an empathetic smile. She held on to Dee while she cried, biting back her own tears. "Thank you for taking care of me, Carol," Dee said before sleep dragged her under. Carol sat awake for hours that night, wondering how she could help her friend. Dee was such a sweet and kind soul. She couldn't for the life of her understand why something like this had to happen to her. Only once she was certain Dee was fast asleep did Carol allow her own tears to come. She wouldn't cry in front of Dee, but now in the dark and the quiet, she wept for what her friend had suffered through. Before she fell asleep, Carol prayed that the Lord heal and strengthen Dee, and that he bless her with a beautiful future, because after today, her friend didn't deserve anything less. She also prayed that the Lord would guide her to finding them a new home, one far away from Sly Skeetle. She also vowed that, although the law wouldn't arrest Sly for his sins, she could warn every single woman in the apartment building to keep a good distance from him. She would even encourage them to move. Chapter 13. 26th of March, 1892, Usher Ranch, Canyon, Texas. If Griswell had been mean while his father was alive, then Simeon wasn't sure what he would call the new owner of the Usher Ranch. Spiteful, cruel, callous, uncaring? At least while Jock had been alive, he had reined in his son's cruel nature as much as he could. But without Jock to control Griswell, matters on the Usher Ranch had gone from bad to worse. Griswell had no clue when it came to ranch operations. Of cattle, he knew little to nothing, which Simeon found rather odd since Griswell had grown up on a cattle ranch. When it came to horses, he knew even less. And when it came to people, especially the ranch hands, Simeon was almost certain that a stray rat would get better treatment from their new boss. When Griswell wasn't cursing and scolding them, he was insulting and belittling them. This wasn't the way Jock had run his ranch, and Simeon wasn't sure for how much longer he would be able to suffer Griswell's leadership. The only reason Simeon hadn't left yet was out of respect for Jock, and because he cared for the ranch hands and what happened to the ranch. He couldn't stand by and watch Griswell run the ranch into the ground that his father had spent so many years building. Although the ranch now belonged to Griswell, Simeon still operated according to the way Jock had taught him. Every couple of months, Simeon and Jock had rounded up a number of steers to take to market. So this morning, after conferring with the ranch hands, Simeon and his men saddled up to round up the cattle. He had just mounted his horse when Griswell came out of the house. He stomped down the porch and walked to Simeon with a leering look. "Off to go and waste your time in the fields again? You do know I don't pay you to take naps under the trees by the creek." Simeon swallowed past the anger that raged inside him at the comment. Griswell was 3 years younger than him, and yet he tried to prove his authority at every opportunity. "If you mean yesterday, the men were riding cattle since dawn. I let them rest by the creek for 2 hours before they went on checking fences," Simeon said evenly. Although he didn't like or respect Griswell, he wouldn't lower himself to be drawn into an argument with the man. Unfortunately, Griswell was now his employer, and Simeon couldn't afford to lose his job. "Fine, but an hour is more than enough to rest," Griswell barked. "Where are you off to?" "We need to round up some steers for tomorrow's auction in town. Your father always had us round up between 20 and 25, depending on their weight," Simeon explained. Griswell shook his head. "My father was too tight-fisted to sell more. We have more expenses this month. You need to round up 50. 50? Simeon asked, surprised. "That's a lot of steers for one auction. Then we won't have enough for the next auction. Then we'll sell some of the heifers. The Usher Ranch belongs to the cattle barons of Canyon, and it's time we lived like cattle barons. Now go and round up them steers and stop questioning my judgment. My father isn't here. It isn't his choice." Griswell all but barked. Simeon wanted to argue. He was even willing to patiently explain to Griswell that selling heifers would harm the ranch's income in the long run, but clearly Griswell didn't want to learn or understand. He kicked his horse into a gallop and set off for the fields, hoping that the clear air would ease his temper and give him some much-needed solace after Griswell's demands. It baffled Simeon how Griswell could have been raised by a man like Jock. It was evident that Simeon had more of his mother's character than his father's. Just like his mother, he was greedy and lazy when it came to work. Not once had Simeon ever witnessed Mel do any chores around the house. Instead, she had made sure that Jock hired a housekeeper to take care of all that for her. Simeon wasn't sure what Mel did with her time, but he was beginning to fear that now that Jock was gone, she would use her time to spend his money. How long before the Usher Ranch was nothing but a few pastures and all the cattle had been sold off? "Are we really going to round up 50 steers?" one of the ranch hands asked, riding up alongside Simeon. Simeon let out a sigh before he shrugged. "It's not our ranch. We do as we're told." "That boy needs to do as he's told. He's going to run this ranch into the ground," the hand said before riding away. Simeon didn't comment, but he couldn't help but agree. He glanced up at the cloudless sky and began to pray. "Lord, what is your plan with the Usher Ranch? Surely you cannot stand by and let Griswell destroy everything his father built. Lord, open Griswell's eyes, open his heart to learning and to becoming the rancher that his father was. Let him care for his men like Jock did. Let him respect the process of ranching cattle instead of just selling off his herd. I beg of you, Lord, use me any way you see fit to make things right for the Usher Ranch again. Amen." When they reached the herd, Simeon couldn't help but feel frustrated. Bringing in 50 head of steers would create a big deficit in their steer availability for the next auction. Nothing had ever been harder than to obey the new owner of the Usher Ranch's orders, especially when you knew they were wrong. Chapter 14. 15th of June, 1892, Chicago, Illinois. Regardless of all Carol's efforts, they simply couldn't afford to move. 3 months after Sly attacked her, Dee was still reeling from the emotional scars it had left. Every day she walked out of their apartment and happened to see Sly. It was as if she was forced to relive the entire ordeal. Carol had been nothing short of a saint, making sure Dee never had to face Sly alone. When she left the apartment, Dee walked with her. When she returned home from work, Carol waited for her on the corner. If it hadn't been for Carol, Dee wasn't sure she might not have done something to hurt herself and put herself out of her misery. Dee knew that she couldn't allow Sly's abuse to be a dark cloud over her future, but she couldn't seem to shake it off. It was a Friday morning, and Dee hadn't gone to work for most of the week. She was down with a terrible bug and couldn't seem to keep any of her food down. This morning, Carol insisted she go and see the doctor, but Dee simply didn't think it was necessary. While she swept the house, she felt the wave of nausea overcome her. She breathed through it, trying to keep her breakfast down for the first time this week, and focused on good thoughts instead. Griswell Usher. Of course, Dee hadn't told Griswell about Sly or the attack. In fact, she hadn't managed to write a single letter to Griswell since. Instead, Carol had taken the liberty of responding to his letters. Both women now hoped and prayed that in time they would receive proposals and finally be able to escape Chicago and Sly Skeetle. This morning, Dee couldn't help but desperately hope that the proposal would come sooner rather than later. She couldn't stand the thought of spending the rest of her life in the city in which she had experienced her worst nightmare. As she swept, she allowed herself to dream of a handsome rancher and a beautiful home. She dreamed of the family she would have and the life they would build together. She dreamed of leaving everything behind, including the terrible memories of that afternoon, and looking forward to her future. This time, when the wave of nausea came, she couldn't hold it back. For the next 30 minutes, wave after wave slammed her. By the time she was empty and exhausted, she knew Carol was right. She couldn't ignore this stomach flu any longer. It was time to see the doctor. Dee washed and dressed before she gathered all her courage and stepped out of the apartment. She could hear Sly's voice coming from the east stairway and headed towards the other stairway. She all but jogged all the way down the stairs and around the corner, only stopping to catch her breath once she was sure she was safe distance from Sly Skeetle. As she walked to the doctor's office, she found herself praying that they would find another apartment in time. Carol had scoured all the advertisements and flyers in their neighborhood, but they simply couldn't afford anything else. And with Dee not bringing in wages this week, it made it even harder. The doctor's surgery was a few blocks from their apartment. Dee had only seen him once or twice in the past. The doctor was an elderly man who ran the practice with his wife as his nurse. As she stepped into the surgery, she couldn't help but feel as if she was being feeble. There were numerous people waiting to be seen by the doctor. A young child with a terrible cough, an old man with an injured arm, and a lady whose skin was the pallor of death. Surely, the doctor had more important things to tend to than her nausea. "Good morning, dear. How can we help you today?" the doctor's wife asked as Dee walked up to the desk. I think I have a stomach flu that won't subside," Dee admitted. "That doesn't sound like fun at all. Why don't you take a seat and Doc Smith will see you in a little while," Mrs. Smith said with a kind smile. It wasn't a little while. It was 2 hours later to be exact. Although the doctor didn't take appointments, it seemed he assessed the patients in the waiting room and helped whoever seemed more in need first. When it was finally Dee's turn, she was shown into his consulting room. "Good morning, Miss Wilkins. How can I help you this morning?" Dr. Smith asked with a kind smile. Dee explained her symptoms and watched as the doctor's gaze drifted to her left hand. "Are you married, Miss Wilkins?" the doctor asked with a frown. Dee shook her head. "No, doctor." Dr. Smith let out a heavy sigh. "When's the last time you had your monthlies?" Dee frowned for a moment before her eyes widened with horror. She hadn't had her monthlies since Sly's attack. She couldn't even manage to form a sentence to answer the doctor before a flood of tears overtook her. The doctor, clearly used to injuries, wounds, and illness, had no idea how to console a woman in tears. He slipped out of the office and returned a few minutes later with his wife. "Honey, what's wrong? Have you missed your monthlies?" Mrs. Smith asked kindly. Dee nodded. 3 months. "Then congratulations are in order. You're 3 months pregnant," Mrs. Smith said kindly. Dee cried even harder. A look passed between the doctor and his wife before Dee and his wife were left alone. After some gentle prodding, Dee confessed to Mrs. Smith about Sly's attack. Finally, being able to share the burden, she continued to explain that they couldn't even move, and when Sly realized she was carrying his child, she feared what he would do. Mrs. Smith listened patiently, and when Dee finally finished, she nodded firmly before stepping out of the room. A short while later, she returned with her husband. No woman has to suffer what you've suffered through. I wish we could do more, but for now, we can offer you and your friend a place to stay. We have a small apartment over the practice. It's actually only suitable for one person, but I'm sure you won't mind sharing. We won't charge you more than you're paying at the moment, and that way I can keep an eye on you during your pregnancy as well, Dr. Smith said with a kind smile. Dee was so overwhelmed by their kindness that she hugged the doctor. Thank you so much, doctor. It's my pleasure. Now go home, pack up, and be back here for dinner. Dee walked out of the surgery feeling relieved that she and Carol would finally be able to move, but shocked at the idea of carrying Sly's child. If she had any hope of starting a new life with Griswell in Texas, she feared that would never happen now. But perhaps, if he finally proposed, he would care enough to understand. Just perhaps, he would love her enough to raise the child as his own. Now, she just had to pray that their courtship would continue until the day that Griswell proposed, because being a single mother in Chicago wasn't a life Dee wished on anyone. Chapter 15. 18th of October, 1892, Usher Ranch, Canyon, Texas. Simeon felt energized as he led the young filly into the horse ring on a crisp fall morning. He had been working with the filly for the last 2 weeks, and today he knew was the day that he would finally be able to mount her and ride her like the wind. This filly was to become the pride of Usher Ranch that had been Jock's dream. Her mother was a mare that Jock had set free with the wild horses, hoping that the stallion would cover her. When he had brought the mare back home, Jock's dreams had been realized. When Simeon had started on the Usher Ranch, now almost 3 years ago, he had helped birth the filly. She had been strong right from the very first day. Over the last few years, Simeon had given her time to gain strength and to grow, keeping his distance, just enough to keep a little of that stallion blood in her veins. Nothing moved like a wild horse, and no horse would ever be more loyal once broken. That was what Jock had taught Simeon. Today, he was going to prove that his mentor was right. The pinto mare stood a foot taller than her mother, and when she was running with the herd in the fields, she outran them all. Simeon couldn't wait to call her his new mount. As he led the pinto mare into the ring, a few of the ranch hands came to watch. All the ranch hands had come to know when Simeon was breaking a horse, which day would be the day he mounted her. On that day, Simeon had become used to having a crowd. Everyone would hold their breath as Simeon took the horse through its paces, before finally leaping onto the horse's back. Simeon quietly spoke to the mare as he attached her halter, leading her around the ring before giving her room and driving her in circles with nothing but his hands. He ran her in circles for almost 2 hours before he stood back and waited for the mare to come to him. All the ranch hands watched as Simeon turned his back to the horse and waited. It was then that he noticed Griswell coming out of the ranch house. Griswell never surfaced from the house before late morning. How he planned on being a rancher, Simeon didn't understand, but over the last few months, he had come to accept that Griswell would never be the man his father had been. "Are you wasting my money again?" Griswell called out as he walked to the ring. "Simeon's about to mount the painted horse," a ranch hand explained. "It's the filly your father bred from the wild stallion." Griswell didn't seem to notice the importance or the sentiment of the moment at all. "I'm still paying you to work, not to play cheerleader," Griswell barked at the men. While Griswell grumbled and complained, Simeon felt the horse nudge his shoulder. There was no greater feeling than that moment when you knew you had a horse's trust. Simeon turned around and the mare allowed him to stroke her neck. With slow, careful movements, he saddled her, careful not to spook her. He shut Griswell's snarky comments out as he tightened the girth. Just as he was about to reach for the reins, Griswell climbed through the rails and grabbed the reins. Before Simeon could stop him, Griswell jumped onto the mare's back. Every single man surrounding the ring understood that this was just like Griswell. He didn't do a single minute of the work, but always wanted to claim the achievement. At first, the painted mare just stood still while Griswell's smile spread from ear to ear. "That, gentlemen, is how you break a horse. You don't talk to it, charm it, or convince it back. You show it who's in charge. Griswell barely finished his sentence before the horse began to buck. Not the usual buck that Simeon had expected, but an aggressive type of bucking. She even swung around in circles and nipped at Griswell's leg, trying to get him off her back. Simeon had never seen a horse trying to bite a man on her back, but it was clear the painted horse didn't want Griswell near or on her. Griswell hung on for dear life as he pulled a whip out of his coat and began to whip the horse. Simeon felt anger course through his veins as his fists clenched at his sides. Griswell could do what he pleased with Simeon, but he wasn't going to whip a horse into submission, especially not a horse that had been Jock's pride and joy. "You whip that mare one more time, Griswell, and I swear I'll take that whip to you," Simeon called out. He distracted Griswell just enough for him to lose his balance and fly off the horse like a wet rag. The mare jogged over to Simeon and nuzzled him as if she knew he was protecting her. Griswell stood up off the dirt, furious. "You will not talk to me that way, you hear. If you want a job, you'll know your place." Griswell cried out. Simeon didn't respond. Griswell had threatened to fire him so many times that he stopped keeping count. If Griswell had wanted him gone, he would have been gone already. Griswell didn't fire him because he knew he couldn't manage the ranch without Simeon, because if Simeon left, the other ranch hands would follow. "If you want loyal ranch hands, you better know your place," Simeon said quietly. "You stay away from this mare, you hear me?" Griswell was fuming, but he didn't argue. He stomped back towards the ranch house, and in that moment Simeon knew that every single ranch hand had just lost what little respect they had for their employer. Once Griswell was finally gone, Simeon stroked the mare. "Are you ready for your first ride?" The mare nickered as if she was saying yes. Simeon smiled and took the reins. "Open the gate," he called to one of the ranch hands. Simeon hopped onto her back, and she didn't even try to buck him off. Instead, they galloped out of the ring and towards the fields as if they had been made to ride together. Chapter 16. 12th of November, 1892, Chicago, Illinois. "Oh my goodness, is that beef stew I smell?" Carol asked as she walked into the small apartment on a cold winter's evening. Dee nodded. "Mrs. Smith surprised us with a hearty beef stew for dinner. She's an angel," Carol said with a happy sigh. "That she is," Dee agreed. Dr. and Mrs. Lee Smith had been nothing but kind to Dee and Carol since they allowed them to move into the apartment above the surgery. Dr. Smith kept an eye on Dee's pregnancy, and when Dee couldn't work at the dress shop anymore, he offered her work in the surgery. Since she couldn't do much now that she was 8 months pregnant, he was really just showing her a measure of charity. Her pregnancy thus far had been perfectly healthy, and the nausea had disappeared the moment Mrs. Smith had taught her about eating ginger biscuits for breakfast. Without them and Carol, Dee didn't know what she would have done. But Carol wouldn't be there much longer, she reminded herself. "You have to answer the letter from Chip, Carol. You can't delay forever." Carol let out a sigh. "It's only been a week. I can wait a little longer," Carol argued as she handed Dee her plate of stew. "Besides, look what came in the mail today." Dee smiled at the sight of a letter from Griswell. "You think it's a proposal?" Carol laughed. "I hope so." Chip had proposed to Carol the week before, and although both Dee and Carol knew that Carol was going to accept the offer of marriage, Carol hadn't responded to his letter because she was hoping for Dee to receive a proposal as well. "Well, let's find out," Dee said, opening the letter. "Ouch, careful there. That's my kidney," Dee laughed as the baby kicked. Although the baby was conceived under the most horrific circumstances, Dee had come to look forward to the prospect of becoming a mother. Mrs. Smith had explained that she could put the baby up for adoption and hope it found a good family, but Dee simply couldn't do that. This baby was hers and hers alone. She couldn't just give it away because Sky Skeetle was the father. She would never burden her baby with the truth, but she would love it just a little more because of it. "Read the letter, Dee," Carol insisted before taking a mouthful of her stew. Dee unfolded Griswell's letter and began to read. A smile curved her mouth as she read the letter. When she was done, she turned to Carol with a hopeful smile. "How soon do you want to leave?" Laughter rang through the small apartment above the doctor's surgery. Everything Dee and Carol had been dreaming of over the last year had finally come true. Not only were they both going to be the wives of ranchers, but they were going to live close enough to visit frequently. "Did he propose?" Carol asked, snatching the letter from Dee's hand. "He did. He even included money for the train fare and incidentals. Now there's only one problem left." Dee sighed, glancing down at her swollen belly. "He says he loves you, Dee. He wants to build a future with you. He'll accept you and the baby. I'm sure of it," Carol assured her as she reached for her hand. "And if he doesn't?" Dee asked, feeling a little doubtful. "He will, and don't think of it any other way. You've been corresponding for the better part of a year. I'd say he's head over heels in love with you, and he won't even blink if he learns the truth about your pregnancy," Carol assured her once again. Dee nodded, feeling hope bloom in her chest. "We're going to be wives this Christmas. Can you believe it?" "And you're going to become a mother before the new year," Carol reminded her. H. "Oh, Dee, all our dreams are coming true, in spite of Sly Skeetle." Just hearing his name made a shiver travel down Dee's spine. She had made sure that Sly didn't know about the baby. They had moved without even giving him a forwarding address, letting both Chip and Griswell know to contact them at their new address. She pushed all thoughts of Sly to the back of her mind and turned to Carol with a beaming grin. "Let's go tell Dr. and Mrs. Smith. Let's." Carol agreed. Both the doctor and his wife were aware of Dee and Carol's dreams of moving to Texas. Dee knew they would be overjoyed for them to finally have their dreams realized. "And when we come back, we can accept our proposals and tell our future husbands when to expect us." "Future husbands," Carol laughed. "I think I just got goosebumps." Nothing was more powerful than hope, and in that moment, Dee felt more powerful than she ever had before. Not even Sly Skeetle and the memory of what he had done could make her feel weak. Chapter 17, 19th of November, 1892, Canyon, Texas. As dawn broke on the horizon, Dee shifted in her seat again. Dr. Smith had warned her that traveling at this late stage of her pregnancy wouldn't only be uncomfortable, but also dangerous. Thus far, she hadn't encountered any problems after spending the last 5 days on the train, but she had aches in places she didn't know even existed. Dee and Carol had both opted for the cheapest train fare, which meant getting a seat instead of a cabin. They wanted to save enough money that if they had any trouble during their journey, they would have cash on hand. For Carol, the journey might have been slightly uncomfortable, but for Dee, carrying the extra weight of the baby, it had been pure torture. She hadn't slept properly since boarding the train in Chicago. Her back felt as if someone had stabbed her with knives, her legs were cramping, and her kidneys were complaining from the baby fighting against the confined space of her belly. Over the last few days, Dee had traveled cross-country to her new home, and she had witnessed the most beautiful scenery. From tall, towering mountains to endless plains. She had seen small towns that were just comprised of a train station, and booming towns like Kansas City, which seemed even larger than Chicago. But today, she would see Canyon. Her heart skipped a beat as excitement coursed through her veins. Late last night, they had crossed over into Texas, and in a couple of hours, she and Dee would finally reach their destination. They had both sent word to their future husbands of their arrival time. Dee and Carol were anxious to meet Griswell and Chip for the first time. The train bumped over the tracks, and Dee instinctively held on to her belly. "Are we there yet?" a sleepy Carol asked, roused from sleep by the bump. "Almost. We're about 2 hours away. The conductor passed by earlier. He said we'll be there by 8 o'clock, right on schedule," Dee explained. "Do we have more ginger biscuits?" Carol nodded and reached for the carpet bag at her feet. She handed Dee a few biscuits. "I'm going to freshen up and change into my new dress." While Carol went to freshen up, Dee wished she had splurged on a new dress. But it just hadn't made sense for her to buy a new dress to fit her large belly when she was only going to be able to wear it for another month. "I know. We'll stretch out soon enough." She spoke to her baby as the morning kicking commenced, the moment she finished her first cookie. When Carol returned, looking prettier than ever, She offered to braid Dee's hair for the occasion. For the last hour of their journey, they promised to write to each other frequently as they began to gather all their things. When the conductor announced that the town in the distance was Canyon, Dee felt her heart begin to race. Although she was certain that Carol was right, she couldn't help but fear Griswell's reaction to her swollen belly. She had considered telling him numerous times through their letters, but had refrained from doing so. She couldn't take a chance that Griswell would turn her down because of it. There was no future for her in Chicago, and although Dr. and Mrs. Smith had been nothing but kind, Dee couldn't rely on their charitable kindness forever. When the train finally came to a stop, only Dee and Carol disembarked. Their luggage was set down on the platform, and both women glanced around the small station, wondering which one of the men was Griswell and which one was Chip. "Maybe they forgot?" Dee said, feeling slightly nervous when the train left and they were still waiting. Carol shook her head. "Don't be so negative. We just have to be patient." Carol had barely finished speaking when a very handsome, very tall man approached them. "Might one of you be Miss Bloom?" he asked in a deep voice. Carol all but swooned. "That will be me. Might you be Chip Jefferson?" Chip took Carol's hand and pressed a kiss to the back of it. "I am, and I am thoroughly charmed by your beauty." Carol blushed. "Why, thank you, Chip. I was beginning to think you forgot your fiancé was arriving today." Chip laughed. "Not in a million years. I've been counting the hours to meet you." Dee couldn't help but smile at their interaction. It was clear that they were smitten with each other. "Are those your things?" Chip asked. Carol pointed to a steam trunk and a carpet bag. "Yes, this is my friend Dee Wilkins. Her fiancé is also coming to collect her." "Is that so?" Chip smiled. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Dee." "You too, Chip," Dee smiled. "Are you ready to go? If we leave now, we can reach the ranch before sundown," Chip asked Carol. Carol turned to Dee. "Do you want us to wait with you? It's no problem." "Is it, Chip?" Carol asked, turning to Chip. Chip shook his head. "Of course not. We can always arrange to spend the night in Canyon if needed." No. Please don't delay your journey home on my behalf. Go on. I'm sure Griswell will be here shortly," Dee insisted. "And write as often as you can." Carol's eyes teared up. "Every day. I'm going to miss you, Dee. Take care of yourself and of that little one. Tell him everything about his Aunt Carol." "How do you know it's a him? Maybe it's a girl," Dee answered tearfully as she hugged her friend goodbye. Chip inquired about where Dee would be living and promised that Carol would come and visit often once the worst of winter was over. After Carol left on a wagon with Chip, Dee couldn't help but feel happy for her friend. Carol deserved the happiness that she had found with Chip, and now Dee just had to hope that she was going to find the same happiness with Griswell. She glanced around the platform and noticed it had become empty while they were talking to Chip. She paced back and forth, stretching her legs as she reminded herself to be patient. Griswell would be there soon. Chapter 18. Griswell Usher. Get out of bed and get on a wagon. She's arriving any moment now. Mel Usher scolded her grown son as she opened his curtains. "Ma, I told you, I don't need no wife." Griswell groaned, pulling a pillow over his head. "Yes, you do. A man is nothing without a wife by his side and an heir to take over his wealth," Mel insisted. "I did everything to make this happen, Griswell. You just have to go and collect her from the train station in Canyon and be nice." "And marry her," Griswell groaned. "What if she's as ugly as a dog?" Griswell asked. "Griswell Usher, do as you're told. I don't care if she has 3 noses and 1 arm. We'll tell everyone that she's from Chicago society and establish your place in the community." "No one cares about beauty. It's about wealth meeting wealth," Mel insisted. "Fine." Griswell rolled out of bed and let out a heavy sigh. "You can still visit the soiled doves over at the saloon whenever you want. Marriage is for appearances, and I understand that. But you will marry this girl," Mel explained. Griswell frowned at his mother. She had become very bossy over these last few months. In a way, he had allowed her to since it was in his nature, but he was getting tired of it. It was time he reminded her on whose ranch she was living and who was in control. "You might think that you're the boss of me, but you're not. Remember who puts the beef on your table and who pays your gambling debt at the secret games you attend with your friends at the hotel. Mel stepped back as if she had been slapped. Don't be mean, Griswell. I'm not. It's the truth. Griswell shrugged. His mother walked out of his room like a dog with her tail between her legs, making Griswell grin. Ever since his father passed away, she had been trying to lord over him like she was his boss. But he was tired of people not respecting him for who he was. He was the owner of the Usher Ranch. Every meal, every item of clothing, and every penny his mother had was thanks to him. He would meet the mail-order bride his mother had arranged for him, but it would be his choice whether or not he wanted to marry her. If it were up to him, he would have married all 3 of the soiled doves who lived over the saloon. They knew how to make him happy, and they knew who was in control. They never questioned him and never argued with him, and they were always grateful for his company. Once he was dressed, Griswell headed outside and noticed the dust cloud on the horizon. The last thing he felt up to now was driving a wagon in this wind. Simeon. Simeon turned to him from where he was taking a horse through its paces. Yes? You need to go into town and collect someone from the train station. Now! Griswell shouted when Simeon didn't seem to move fast enough. Who? Simeon asked once he handed the horse over to another ranch hand. My future wife. Now make it quick. She's already been waiting for an hour, Griswell barked. Less than 10 minutes later, Simeon was driving the wagon into town, leaving a trail of dust in his wake. He could for the life of him not understand why Griswell didn't want to meet his own bride at the train station, or why he had kept her waiting for such a long time. Nor could he understand how any woman would want to marry such a conniving brute. But then, he reasoned, she probably hadn't yet met Griswell Usher in person. Simeon had heard of mail-order brides coming to the West and had even heard of more than a few that had turned out to be true love. He just wasn't sure if Griswell even deserved a coupling that resembled love. As he drove into town, Simeon wondered if perhaps he shouldn't take out an advertisement in the Matrimonial Times. He had been so focused on the Usher Ranch over the last few years that he hadn't even considered finding a woman to court. The soiled doves over the saloon held no appeal for him, and there weren't many other women in Canyon that were available. And even if there were, Simeon had barely any time to himself, never mind the time to court a woman. He found himself remembering his mother and how she had told him what a wonderful gift love could be. She had always hoped that one day Simeon would have a loving wife and a family, but those dreams hadn't been within his reach just yet. When he reached the train station late that afternoon, Simeon climbed down from the wagon and walked onto the platform. In the far corner, he noticed a woman sitting on a steam trunk, looking rather lost and forlorn. At that very moment, she looked up and Simeon felt his heart skip a beat. She was the most beautiful creature he had ever seen. Her hair was dark brown with a shimmer of red, her eyes the color of grass in the spring. Her skin looked like pure alabaster. He stopped to catch his breath, reminding himself that she was Griswell's bride before he continued towards her. Hello? Simeon asked when he reached her. She looked up at him and smiled with a hopeful look. If Simeon had thought she was pretty before, he wasn't even sure what he would call her when she smiled. Breathtaking? Griswell? Griswell Usher? She asked in a voice as sweet as an angel's. Simeon shook his head as he took off his hat. Simian Manch. It's a pleasure to meet you, miss. Mr. Usher asked me to come for you. He's tied up at the moment. Simeon simply didn't have it in him to tell her that Griswell was too lazy to come and get her himself. I'm Dee, Cassandra Dee Wilkins, Dee said, holding out her hand. The moment she placed her hand in his, Simeon wished for the very first time in his life that he could have been Griswell Usher. Griswell didn't deserve such a beautiful woman with such kind eyes. It was only when she stood up that Simeon noticed her swollen belly. Simeon was too well-mannered to inquire about it, and instead carried her luggage to the wagon. Once she was seated beside him, Simeon stole a glance at her and wondered if she was aware of Griswell's nature and innate character. It wasn't his place to warn her, but Simeon couldn't help but pity her if she was to become Griswell's bride. Chapter 19. The moment Dee laid eyes on Simeon, she felt her heart skip a beat and then swell with hope in her chest. He was tall and attractive, but it was his kind eyes that had made her hope that he was Griswell Usher. As they traveled to the ranch, Simeon held his silence. After about 10 minutes, Dee was too curious to hold hers. "Are you a friend of Griswell?" "No, ma'am." Simeon shook his head. "I'm a ranch hand at the Usher Ranch." "Oh," Dee said, feeling slightly taken aback that Griswell had sent a ranch hand to collect her. "What is the ranch like?" Dee asked when Simeon didn't say anything else. She watched as his whole face lit up. "It's like heaven on earth. Miles and miles of sprawling pasture, small thatches of trees to give you shade in the summer, and a cool stream to cool down in. In winter, this time of year, it has a different kind of beauty, the kind that makes you feel hopeful for when spring arrives. It might not look like much now, but when spring comes, it's green and lush." "Sounds like you've been there for a while?" Dee asked. Simeon nodded. "About 3 years now. I was hired by Griswell's father, Jock, the best rancher and kindest man I've ever met." The sun had begun its descent in the east, and Dee couldn't help but admire the beautiful sunset. Bold strokes of color covered the sky as the vast landscape spread out around them. "This is nothing like Chicago." "Is that where you're from?" Simeon asked. Dee nodded. "Yes, it's never like this. It's always windy, cloudy, or raining." Dee laughed. "It's not known as the Windy City for nothing." Simeon shrugged. "Never heard it being called that. There's the ranch house." Simeon pointed to a beautiful log house in the distance. "Oh my goodness, it's much larger than I anticipated," Dee said with admiration. "It's beautiful." "I know, Jock built it with his own hands," Simeon said proudly. Dee was mesmerized by the ranch as Simeon pointed out the bunkhouse, a herd of cattle, the horse stables, and his own cabin in the distance. Griswell had told her in his letters that the ranch was big, but she hadn't realized how expansive big had meant. Simeon stopped in front of the house and helped her down from the wagon. "Welcome home, ma'am." "Why, thank you, Simeon, and for bringing me from the station," Dee thanked Simeon. Simeon climbed into the wagon and headed towards the stables as Dee started up the porch. Before she could knock, the door opened. A statuesque woman in her late 40s opened the door, wearing a beautiful dress. "You must be Dee Wilkins?" The moment the woman glanced down and took in Dee's belly, a frown furrowed her forehead. "Oh dear." Dee smiled, ignoring the woman's response. "You must be Griswell's mother, Mrs. Usher?" "Yes, that's me," Mrs. Usher said flatly. "I'll tell Griswell that you've arrived." She shut the door in Dee's face, which Dee found a little strange. She waited a few moments before the door opened again, this time to reveal a man about her age, younger than Simeon, she judged. He didn't have Simeon's kind eyes. Instead, he had a disapproving look. "You're Dee Wilkins?" he barked instead of asking. Dee nodded, feeling slightly out of sorts. "I'm sorry. It's been a very long day. Do you mind if I use your restroom?" Dee didn't need the restroom, but she needed a moment to steady herself for the explaining she needed to do, and she needed to pray that Griswell and his mother would understand. "Yes, of course. Down the hall to your right. I'll meet you in the drawing room," Griswell said curtly. A short while later, Dee walked into the drawing room only to find Griswell and his mother standing side by side, waiting for her. "You have a lovely home," Dee complimented, hoping to break the ice. "You didn't tell me you were pregnant," Mrs. Usher accused her. Dee frowned. "You mean I didn't tell Griswell? It doesn't matter." Mrs. Usher waved the correction away. "Whose baby is it?" Dee drew in a deep breath and explained that during her correspondence with Griswell, she had been attacked and raped. She hoped for understanding and prayed for sympathy, but instead she received nothing but cold indifference. "You couldn't even get this right, could you, Mother?" Griswell shouted at his mother. "You find me a bride that's carrying another man's child, and now you expect me to marry her? You asked her here. You get rid of her. I want nothing to do with her." Griswell barked before he turned to Dee. "Did you really think I was going to marry you? You're nothing but damaged merchandise." Dee had to bite back the tears that were burning her eyes. "But," Mrs. Usher stepped forward, "you heard my son. You're not welcome here. Leave now." "But where should I go? I don't have anywhere to go?" Dee all but pleaded, feeling all her dreams scattering around her. "That, my dear, isn't my problem. Now get." Mrs. Usher cried out with anger. Dee could hardly see through the tears as she scurried out of the beautiful house. She grabbed her carpet bag and dragged her steam trunk as she put distance between her and the horrible Usher family. As she walked, tears streamed down her cheeks, not knowing where she was going to go or what she was going to do. It was the middle of winter, and she didn't only have herself to think of, she needed to think of her baby as well. If she slept out in the open, she might just catch her death from the cold. That's when she noticed a faint light burning in the direction that Simeon had told were the stables. The stables. She could stay there tonight and tomorrow. She would try to find a way out of the horrible mess in which she had found herself. Chapter 20. 20th of November, 1892. Simeon always started his day at the stables. Nothing brightened his day like visiting the horses and checking on them first thing in the morning. This morning, he was up early, having tossed and turned all night about the beautiful woman whom he had delivered to the wolf's den. He wanted to warn her against Griswell, but he knew it wasn't his place. Instead, he had prayed that the Lord would guide her and protect her against Griswell's mean-tempered ways. As he walked into the barn, the scent of hay and horses surrounded him. Simeon drew in a deep breath and began to make his rounds. The painted mare he had broken in a month before had become an attention hog. If Simeon didn't stop by her stable first, she would nicker and whinny until he gave her a few rubs. "Mornin'," Simeon said as he walked through the stables. "Where's the prettiest girl in my life?" The painted mare whinnied in response to his question. Simeon chuckled as he reached her. He rubbed her nose before sneaking her a few sugar cubes, knowing that Griswell would complain about it. But Simeon bought the sugar cubes for the horses using his own wages, since Griswell was too tight-fisted to spend money on anything necessary, and rather wasted too much money at the saloon and on the soiled doves. Griswell thought no one knew, but Canyon was a small town. Everyone knew. "How did you sleep? Feeling up for a ride up to the north pasture today?" Simeon asked the mare. The mare reared up slightly with excitement, making Simeon laugh. That's when he heard a woman's muffled cry. A frown creased his brow as he opened the stable door and stepped inside. In the corner of the painted mare's stable lay Dee, covered in straw and dirt, her eyes swollen from crying. "Come." Simeon took the mare's halter and led her into another stall before returning to Dee. "What happened? Did he hurt you?" Simeon asked, feeling anger pulse through his veins. Dee shook her head. "No, he didn't hurt me. He threw me off the ranch. Turns out he never wrote to me at all. It was his mother that lured me here." Simeon cursed under his breath. The length of their cruelty simply has no end. "It's my fault, really." Dee sniffled as she wiped her face with the back of her hand. Simeon shook his head. "Come, I need to get you out of here before the other ranch hands arrive. Can you walk?" Dee nodded, wide-eyed and confused. "I'm not going to hurt you. I'm just taking you somewhere safe. I'm taking you to my cabin," Simeon explained. He picked up her steam trunk and her carpet bag before reaching for her hand. Dawn had yet to break as they scurried up the incline towards his cabin. Once Dee was out of sight, Simeon could finally take a deep breath. "You'll be safe here." "Thank you," Dee said gratefully. "I'll leave as soon as it's light out." "Where will you go?" Simeon asked with a frown. When Dee didn't answer, Simeon let out a heavy sigh. "Who's the father of the baby?" Simeon sat and listened as Dee explained what had happened to her and how she had believed Griswell loved her enough to accept her condition. When she was done, Simeon knew what he needed to do. Even if he had doubts, his heart insisted it was the right thing to do. "You'll stay here. Just make sure you stay out of sight, but you'll be safe here. I can't let you leave knowing you have nowhere else to go. Besides, that baby is going to arrive any day now, and I can't have you out on a trail somewhere knowing I could have helped you," Simeon explained. "You can take the bedroom. I'll take the couch." Dee frowned. "Why are you being so kind to me?" Simeon shrugged. "It's the right thing to do." Prosody rate %. It's what my mother would have done, and it's what Griswell's father would have done if he had still been around. Simeon shook his head. "Griswell and his mother are nothing like Jock. I wish I could have met him. It sounds like you cared about him a great deal." Simeon nodded. I never had a father growing up, but Jock was like a father to me in the end. He glanced out the window and noticed movement at the bunkhouse. I've got to go, but make yourself at home and get some rest. You need it. While Simeon walked back to the stables, he wasn't sure how he was going to hide Dee forever, but he knew he had to protect both her and her baby from the Ushers. Dee didn't deserve what had happened to her, and she didn't deserve Griswell and Mel's treatment of her now. Chapter 21, 14th of December, 1892, Usher Ranch, Canyon, Texas, S. For more than 3 weeks, Dee called Simeon's cabin home. Although it wasn't large, it was the safe haven she had always dreamed of. Then there was Simeon. Everything Dee had dreamed that Griswell would be was what Simeon embodied. He was kind, gentle, caring, and generous. He didn't judge her for being pregnant. He treated her like a lady and made her feel as if nothing and no one could harm her. They could talk for hours about anything, and the more time they spent together, the more Dee realized that they had the same dreams for the future. She might have come to Texas to marry a rancher, but now she couldn't help but hope to have a future with the head ranch hand instead. She had believed she had fallen in love with Griswell through letters, only to learn he hadn't written a single one. But with Simeon, she was falling in love with the real man. Regardless of her past, her condition, or her reasons for coming to the Usher Ranch, Simeon had accepted her. She couldn't be certain, but she had a feeling that Simeon had feelings for her as well. The way he looked at her when he thought she didn't know it, and the way he smiled at her, made her wonder if perhaps he was falling in love with her as well. Or at least she hoped. Dee knew he was just being kind, but how could she not feel her heart opening up to a man whose kindness reached beyond anything she had ever expected? She couldn't do much to repay him for his kindness, but she could clean his cabin to the best of her abilities given her current condition. Scrubbing the floors was a challenge she couldn't take on, but she could dust and do the laundry. While she set about dusting the small living room, she found an official-looking envelope on the writing desk. Dee frowned, noticing that the envelope hadn't even been opened, although it was dated 25th of February, 1892. She set it aside and waited for Simeon to return from his day on the ranch, and then she asked him about it over dinner. Simeon shrugged as he put his plate away, looking slightly awkward. "I'm sure it ain't nothing important." Dee shook her head. "Simeon, it's from a law firm, one in Canyon. It might be important." "Look," Simeon sighed. "I never learned to read. I can saddle a horse, round up a herd of cattle, and tell whether or not rain's comin' for the next week, but reading wasn't something I ever learned." Dee's heart swelled for the man in front of her. She could imagine how hard it must be for him to admit that. In Chicago, illiteracy wasn't uncommon, so she didn't understand why he seemed so ashamed of it. "You know much more than I do when it comes to ranching, so why don't you teach me about that and I'll teach you how to read?" Simeon nodded, looking slightly ashamed. "Would you like me to read it?" Dee offered. Simeon gave a non-committal shrug. "If you really feel it might be important." Dee opened the letter and gasped before reading the final paragraph. "Simeon, you have to hear this." This time when she read, it was out loud. "Dear Simeon, if you received this letter, it means that I have gone to meet my Maker and join your mother in the hereafter. There is something I never could tell you, but I know it's time you knew the truth. I am your father. Your mother and I were in love, and I planned on marrying her when she suddenly disappeared. I learned too late that it was Mel's sister, your mother's employer, who threatened your mother to leave Canyon and never return. They had intervened in our fate and instead plotted against us to arrange a marriage between Mel and me. I also learned too late that I had a son, otherwise I would have searched the ends of the earth to find her. Your mother was and always has been my first and true love. Although I cared and provided for Mel, I never loved her in the way I loved your mother. That makes you my eldest son. I hope the time we spent together was as cherished by you as it was by me. It was a privilege to finally meet you and to become acquainted with the good man you have become. I wouldn't have expected anything else. I always knew Grace would make a wonderful mother. Find enclosed in this letter my final will and testament. My lawyer is waiting to hear from you before Griswell and Mel are informed that you are the sole inheritor of Usher Ranch, the livestock, and all my dividends at the bank. Provision has been made for Griswell and Mel to start a new life elsewhere, but my legacy I leave to you, my oldest son. You, Simian Manch, are my pride and joy, and although I never married your mother, I hope that you will take my name as your own. My deepest affection, Jock Usher. Dee could see that Simeon was reeling from the news of not only his inheritance but his parentage. She reached for his hand and searched his gaze. It's yours, Simeon. It's all yours. Chapter 22. 24th of December, 1892, Usher Ranch, Canyon, Texas. Simeon stood on the porch of the ranch house and watched as the sheriff accompanied Mel and Griswell off of Usher Ranch. He wouldn't feel guilty, he promised himself. It was because of Mel and her sister's conniving that his mother had been left to raise him alone. He also knew that Jock had made more than sufficient provision for both Mel and Griswell to start a new life elsewhere. From what he had heard, they planned on moving to Fort Worth. Perhaps the city would be better suited to Mel, who always wanted to be part of society, and Griswell, who had never had the heart to become a rancher. Thankfully, Jock had explained the entire situation to his lawyers, and when Simeon and Dee had gone to see the lawyer, it was a simple matter of contacting the sheriff to accompany him to deliver the news and the amended will. At first, Mel and Griswell were outraged, until they learned of the large sum of money they had been bequeathed. Griswell had made outrageous remarks when he learned that Dee had never left Usher Ranch. But as the new owner of the ranch, Simeon had quickly reined him in and made it clear that he would be meeting his own whip if another word was said against Dee. Simeon turned to Dee and felt his heart swell with love. Over the last few weeks, he had fallen head over heels in love with her and wanted nothing more than to build his future on the Usher Ranch with her by his side. But he wasn't sure she felt the same. He had gathered the courage to take over the ranch. Now he just needed to find the courage to ask for Dee's hand in marriage. Dee suddenly turned to him with a horrified expression as a cry of pain sounded through the air. Simeon, I think it's time. For a moment, Simeon froze before he called to one of the ranch hands to fetch the midwife. The rest of the day passed by in a blur of worry and pacing. While Dee and the midwife were locked in the main bedroom, Simeon prayed for the Lord to keep both her and the baby safe. It was long after midnight when the screams of a baby filled the Usher Ranch house. Simeon felt relief wash over him while he waited for the midwife to bring him the news. "Congratulations, it's a boy," the midwife said, coming down the stairs a short while later. "Your wife would like you to meet your son." Simeon's heart swelled at the words. There was nothing in the world he wanted more than to be the boy's father and Dee's husband. He made his way to the bedroom and had never seen a more beautiful sight than Dee holding her newborn son. "Merry Christmas, Simeon." Dee smiled as he walked into the room. Simeon's eyes widened with surprise. "I completely forgot it's Christmas Day." Dee laughed. "Been a little preoccupied? Come, meet Noel." Simeon moved towards the bed and had never experienced such a rush of love and joy overwhelm him as he touched the baby's hand. It was tiny and perfect as two fingers curved around one of his own. "He's perfect," Simeon said before meeting Dee's gaze. "So are you." Dee smiled. "If it wasn't for you, Simeon, I don't want to even begin to imagine where we might have been. And you never have to again." Simeon felt that courage he had been seeking rush through his veins. "Dee, I know we've only known each other for a short while, but I love you, and I love Noel. I want us to live here as a family. I want to raise him as my own and give him many siblings to play with. I want us to build our own legacy right here where Jock built his. Will you marry me, Dee?" Laughter and tears blended as Dee smiled into his gaze. "I love you too, Simeon. I thought you'd never ask." Simeon smiled as he kissed Dee for the very first time. The family he had always wanted was finally within his reach. In that moment, Simeon realized that although life had given him more challenges than he had expected, every single challenge had brought him to this moment in time. A moment in time where he was blessed beyond measure, happier than ever before, and hopeful for a future he knew would be nothing but beautiful. The midwife sniffed behind them, neither knowing she had stepped back into the room. I can send for the sheriff. I'm sure he'll be happy to wed you right now. That way, Noel's birth will be recorded in wedlock, and Simeon will be recorded as his father. Simeon and Dee shared a smile. Please, send for the sheriff. As morning dawned on Christmas Day, both Dee and Simeon knew that although they seemed out of reach at times, Christmas miracles did happen. They spent their first Christmas as a family, celebrating not only their faith, but also fate that had brought them together. Neither had known what the Lord's plan had been for their future, but they now knew that becoming a family had been part of that plan all along. That evening, when Dee wrote her first letter to Carol from Usher Ranch, she told her friend about how a devastating turn of events had led her to the love of her life and a Christmas miracle, and a little baby boy named Noel.